Should anyone be ashamed of their nation's history? Should anyone be proud of it? The issue of pride or shame for the past has at least four sides. It requires elaboration from philosophical, moral, psychological, and historical standpoints. Usually, when we talk about shame and pride in historical context, we imply our attitude to the atrocities of progress. With monuments toppling down, enslavement or colonization reparation demands growing in number and ferocity, a return to good old days of wars of conquest, and the global brand new trend of score settling, a moral dilemma of reconciliation of the brutality of progress and its role in forging the new civilization emerges, shaping our attitude to pride and shame. History, according to Hegel, is a controversial movement forward, the slaughter bench at which the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have been victimized in the name of prosperity and freedom as people believe it at that moment. And shame and pride for historical actions depend on the dominant view at the moment of assessment. So it makes sense to presume that progress is twofold, like any complex notion is, bringing suffering and exploitation while enlightening and improving the everyday lives of billions, and should be treated as such, acknowledging both shame and pride taken together as a catalyst. Moreover, the society should start planning the progress in order to have less grounds for shame in the future. The concept of shame. The question of whether individuals or nations should feel shame or pride for historical events should be answered on the basis of fluidity of morality with time and across cultures. Both are social fictions dependent on the religious, philosophical, and temporal environment. For ancient Greeks, shame was a response to dishonor. Confucian ethics construed it as a reaction to breach of social order, while Maoris treated shame as a means of restorative justice. Thus, shame's function varies greatly with regard to cultures and times, while pride usually has an opposite meaning. Judging, for instance, a 12th century event as we would judge it nowadays amounts to blatant presentism, refusing to challenge it, to amnesia. Historians' views on that point could significantly differ. For instance, Leopold von Ranke advocates objectivity and depicting the history exactly as it actually was, while Charles Mills believed in a tacit agreement between Europeans to assert and promote the ideas of white supremacy against all others. This tension between moral relativism and ethical accountability is the base of historical reckoning. Philosopher Isaiah Berlin called it the brook timber of humanity, which means that progress is inseparable from moral frailty, and demanding purity is denying reality. The question arises whether shame is useful for a nation, since people have plentiful psychological instruments of development without excessive self-harm. Carl Jung introduced the concept of the shadow, the oppressed shameful aspects of the psyche. Extrapolating from an individual to societies gives rise to the same concept at the collective mind level. Ignoring the shadow leads to psychological fragmentation, while integrating it fosters maturity. So shame and pride are catalytic instruments for the humanity to transform. Viewing the past experience from standpoints both shame and pride is necessary for a healthy society to mature, just exactly as a child learns from both mistakes and achievement. As Friedrich Nietzsche put it, we need history for life in action. Shame and pride are not mutually exclusive but intertwined responses to the complexity of history. The concept of progress. Throughout history, civilizations rose, developed, and fell, but the humanity on the whole benefited from enlightenment, moral improvement, and technological progress. The question is whether it is a real achievement or a narrative to legitimize exploitation, while not significantly changing the lives. Figuratively speaking, one must admit that the concept of societal progress is akin to a famous Maslow's pyramid, adopted on a greater scale. Like people, the societies go through various stages of satisfying their needs. Initially, people need food, security, and shelter. With time, they start craving knowledge or making the world better. In order to transfer from one stage to another, a person needs to satisfy current stage's needs first, which requires experience and resources. For the societies accumulating resources for a breakthrough has always taken the form of plunder, overexploitation, or an equivalent exchange, most famous cases of which we'll elaborate further on. Naturally, the methods used led to atrocities and casualties. While Enlightenment thinkers were of an opinion that the progress was an unstoppable eradication of inequalities through constant education and scientific achievements, others argued that the Western progress relied on the systematic negation of other cultures, slavery, and colonial resources. The right answer is that progress resists moral absolutism. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. If we are to evaluate progress, we must weigh its gains against its costs. The concept of collective responsibility. One should distinguish between shame and responsibility for historical wrongs, as this question lies far beyond historian scholarly matters. Should Germans be accountable for the Holocaust, Japanese for the Nanjing massacre, or Russians for the Gulag or Holodomor, is a question of law and morale. Legally, collective responsibility is a nonsense, as it lacks the guilt, which is an attribute of an individual and could not be inherited or extrapolated. Naturally, no one of sound mind would persecute a contemporary German citizen for Holocaust. As Aaron Hanna wrote, where all are guilty, no one is. Confessions of collective guilt are the best possible safeguard against the discovery of culprits. But moral, political, and metaphysical types of guilt exist, according to Karl Jaspers, and they require not persecution but introspection and thoughtful revision. Post-war Germany adhered to this concept and passed through this term, coming to terms with the past, which transformed its national identity and made it one of the peaceful and modernized societies of the world. On the contrary, Turkey fiercely rejects the Armenian genocide. On the 24th of April 2019, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan even tweeted, "The relocation of the Armenian gangs and their supporters was the most reasonable action that could be taken in such a period." Refusal to accept the wrongdoings of the past could be an evidence of deep internal unconscious guilt, which, unless reckoned with, could lead to cycles of violence, denialism, and inability to further progress. The history of humanity is rich with controversial experiences, one of the most notorious being slavery. Despite the initial humanitarian aspect, the winners began to spare lives instead of murdering the captives. This practice undoubtedly deserves condemnation. When enjoying the Colosseum or Virgil's poems, one should not forget about the price in human lives and humiliation paid. The main value creation driver of the pre-industrial world was labor and access to raw materials, only later followed by innovation and mass production. So plundering the neighbors and exploiting the slave labor were the regular methods of accumulating the resources. Yet despite this grim side of the story, Europeans were the first to acknowledge their guilt and forbid the slave trade as early as in 1792 Denmark or 1807 Great Britain, turning to much more effective wage labor instead. By contrast, the Arab slave trade discontinued only in the 20th century, with Mauritania being the latest in 1981, and generally Arab societies negate guilt despite no fewer than 14 million African slaves trafficked and the existence of slave trade in sultanates like Zanzibar. One can see a drastic difference in the approach to past wrongs between forward-looking societies and those that glorify the heyday of the past. Colonialism is usually blamed for its cruelty and suffering it brought to indigenous people of the subdued countries. The horrors of the exploitation of Belgian Congo, where hands were cut off for underperforming, or British hypocritical wars for freedom of trade, meaning for the freedom of drug trafficking, known as the Opium Wars, leave a disgusting feeling. But having all this said, one cannot deny medicine, education, infrastructure, railways, and other achievements brought by colonizers. While Great Britain allegedly drained up to 65 trillion US dollars from India in 1765 to 1947, as Utsa Patnaik states, the British Empire proved that empire can work, as Niall Ferguson opposes, claiming that the British rule introduced critical infrastructure and suppressed backward practices, as well as that the colonial rule was a necessary catalyst for global progress. As 60 years have passed since the mass liberation of former colonies, we can now assess the outcome. Only some of them flourish, predominantly Asian nations such as Singapore, a trade hub with 24 times bigger GDP than in 1965, with the majority still living in poverty. Some of the countries, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, had their GDP drop even lower than under French colonial rule, while others, like Somalia, broke into pieces. Frankly speaking, all the quasi-colonies left, be it Curaçao or Tahiti, do not yearn for freedom. The reason for this is an unbiased assessment of the situation in the majority of the countries that fought for freedom and received Idi Amin instead. The truth is that former imperial powers jettisoned the ballast plunging the ill-prepared nations into survival mode. With all the previous expenditures in the infrastructure discontinued, it was a matter of time when the situation would drastically worsen. Crusades are also a very controversial part of our history, blamed by some and praised by others. The prevailing view is that the Crusades were unprovoked aggressive campaigns with solely expansionist goals, disguised as religious missions. Yet the perspective shifts dramatically when viewed through the lens of contemporary Christian community. The Crusaders were convinced they were liberating their Christian brethren, languishing under the yoke of merciless Muslim conquerors. Indeed, just in 1073, Palestine inhabited by Christians was conquered by Muslim Seljuk Turks, which was accompanied by monstrous atrocities according to Pope Urban II's Clermont sermon of 1095. Thousands murdered or raped, holy sites destroyed, pilgrims robbed and murdered. In previous decades, the Seljuks reduced the Christian Byzantine domain by 75%, which resulted in Empress Alexius I Komnenos' request for armed support. While the sack of Jerusalem in 1099 allegedly claimed 70,000 lives, Crusader states facilitated cross-cultural exchange, like the medical school of Salerno, which synthesized Greek, Latin, and Arabic knowledge, preserving texts which later fueled the scientific revolution. So the modern society should admit the duality of this historical event. While the Crusades enriched culture and spurred Renaissance humanism, they also stimulated cycles of religious violence. As we have already established that shame and pride are complex concepts, and that the progress of humanity has inevitably come at the cost of suffering of the less fortunate, I would suggest changing the question where to answer to whether it is possible to manage the progress in a way that would reduce the collateral damage and the grounds for the shame for the past. Fyodor Dostoevsky, a famous Russian author, grappled with the question in his masterpiece The Brothers Karamazov, whether even universal knowledge justifies a child's tear. Without going to the idealistic extremes of primeval golden age or the era of communism and admitting that life is more complicated than black and white, the answer should be that progress brings positive changes to humanity, but it is impossible without shedding a tear, or regrettably a drop of blood. Therefore, we should face this reality knowingly and exercise every effort to minimize the collateral damage to innocent people. Consciousness and planning should be the key to the sustainable progress of humanity. That is why we need to meet the past with curiosity, not certainty, since the past is the only problem. It keeps changing, and it must not be exploited. If done, we will have many more reasons to feel pride, not shame for our past.